Welcome to the final episode on the case of Ireland's Magdalene Laundries. I need to say this is an educational series. All sources of information I have used here are publicly available. Each source will be clearly titled and listed in the description. This series is not intended to promote violence or hatred against any individual or groups. I do not mean to insult or disrespect anyone I speak about here. We're going to discuss various aspects of Ireland's Magdalene Laundries today, including the subject of physical abuse, which some viewers could find disturbing. I'll go through some final details contained in the IDC report and what occurred following the state apology in 2013 right up until today. So there's quite a bit to go through. Get yourself comfortable. You're very welcome to a drop in the ocean, and we'll dive right in. In this final chapter of our documentary series on Ireland's Magdalene Laundries, we delve deeper into the unsettling alliances between religious orders and the state, unearthing a further complex web of funding, exploitation and systemic neglect. After the year 1922, these institutions, ostensibly dedicated to reform and care, received financial support from the government, sometimes contingent on the financial status of the religious orders themselves. So if the financial record of the religious orders showed a deficit, the state would grant funding to accommodate this. State funding was also allocated based on a classification system of individuals, where girls and women were deemed disabled, encompassing those labelled as mentally deficient, elderly, physically handicapped, deaf, unstable, alcoholic, epileptic or deformed, found themselves confined within these walls. Moreover, the revenue commissioners granted the Magdalene Laundries charitable tax exemptions, further bolstering their financial standing. Shockingly, the state openly admitted that confining these vulnerable people within these institutions was a cost-saving measure, stating that other forms of care or assistance would burden the state financially. There was a fair wages clause in effect from 1912 onwards. Despite the existence of a fair wages clause since 1912, designed to ensure just compensation and reasonable working conditions for labour funded by the government, the Magdalene Laundries operated in stark violation of these principles. This clause, intended to prevent worker exploitation, was conveniently overlooked in the case of these institutions. Questions arose about the discrepancy between the ethical guidelines set by the state and the stark reality faced by the women in the laundries, whose forced labour allowed the religious congregations to undercut commercial competitors and secure numerous lucrative contracts. In essence, the clause ensures that when someone receives government funds for a project, that they must pay their workers fair wages and adhere to reasonable working hours as if they were working directly for the government. Following an amendment, this fair wages clause applies to any awards or compensation granted by the government, even if the funds are semi-governmental. It emphasises the government's responsibility to ensure fair wages and working conditions in all cases where public money is involved. Despite the existence of this fair wages clause, discussions about applying this clause to laundry contracts with institutions like the Magdalene Laundries were often delayed. Trade unions and commercial laundry companies raised concerns because the low prices offered by the Magdalene Laundries, made possible by the forced labour of the girls and women, made it impossible for other businesses to compete. Surprisingly, the state still gave numerous contracts to the Magdalene Laundries, including many government departments, defence forces, state-funded hospitals and clinics, as well as schools and colleges, despite the violation of fair wages standards. The IDC report highlighted a notebook from Magdalene survivors received through Stephen O'Riordan, producer and director of the documentary The Forgotten Maggies. This was the first ever Irish-made documentary on the Magdalene Laundries. Once the documentary, which was highly acclaimed, aired in 2009, the survivors who had featured in the documentary were the first survivors of the Magdalene Laundries ever to receive an invitation to speak with members of Parliament. Some families placed girls and women in Magdalene Laundries. This was often at the recommendation or insistence of a priest or nun. These were mostly girls or women living in impoverished conditions, those considered promiscuous or difficult to handle, those with unwed mothers, those who were unwed mothers, those facing mental or physical challenges, those who were victims of abuse in the home, or those whose families were informed a good education was to be had in a Magdalene laundry. McGarr solicitors distilled the essence of this chapter, asking and answering what was wrong with us and our parents and grandparents that we allowed this to happen. It wasn't passively allowed to happen. It was the result of a deliberate policy by people with power in Irish society, state, church, male heirs, to contain and destroy the threat of social disruption posed by those without power, people in poverty, women, people with mental or physical disadvantages. The religious congregations made no PRSI contributions on behalf of the women, rendering them ineligible for social insurance coverage, and crucially, they were unable to receive a pension as a result. From Justice for Magdalene's research, Minister for Social and Family Affairs Mary Hanifin confirmed that the nuns never submitted PRSI contributions for the women, despite there being a statutory obligation to do so since 1953. States' failure to enforce statutory obligation under 1953 Social Welfare Act. The Minister's response underscores that the religious congregations operating the laundries neither withheld such payments nor submitted payments on behalf of the women workers to the state, despite there being a statutory obligation to do so since 1953. Minister Mary Hanifin stated, according to a search of the department's records in the time available, there do not appear to be returns available in relation to any organisation or organisations which may be collectively described as Magdalene Laundries. Chapter 12, the Factories Acts and Regulation of the Workplace. This chapter can be condensed into three main points. Firstly, the machinery, fire escapes, electrics, flooring, lighting and such in some of the Magdalene Laundries from time to time were inspected by state factory inspectors, who were informed not to speak to the girls and women, not to inspect the living quarters, with one such factory inspector now retired telling the IDC he had been instructed by his supervisor not to send a contravention letter to the nuns, which is a letter detailing any faults found during the inspection and directing rectification. The girls and women in Magdalene Laundries were never monitored by any state entity or individual, except for a few social workers and probation officers who reportedly occasionally revisited girls they had initially placed there, demonstrating a failure to fulfill human rights obligations. A factory manager who had been employed in a Magdalene laundry told the IDC that he only knew of 3 bad industrial accidents that occurred, stating, the one in which the lady lost her forearm in the calendar, the large roller iron, I am reliably told by a resident, was completely her own fault. The IDC report states, the results of the financial analysis carried out tends to support a view that the Magdalene laundries were operated on a subsistence or close to break-even basis, rather than on a commercial or highly profitable basis. The religious congregations responsible for the Magdalene laundries would be financially supported by the convents where they lived. However, the financial records shown to us in the IDC report showed the nuns' living expenses were categorised as expenses related to the laundry. The maintenance expenses of girls and women were also included in laundry expenses, which meant that the girls and women were essentially forced into labour to pay for their own confinement. The IDC report refers to the non-payment of wages of the girls and women in a couple of different places. In Chapter 20, they state wages were not paid either to girls or women who worked in the laundries or to the members of the religious congregations who also worked there. Regarding living expenses, the IDC report tells us general maintenance expenses for the girls and women include costs in relation to food, clothing, infirmary, household, which is residential quarters, such as fuel and so on. Now we're going to have a look at Galway Magdalene Laundry financial records from the IDC report, because we have what is shown to us in the report and then we also have some additional information. The financial calculations shown to us in the report regarding the Galway Magdalene Laundry was given to the IDC by the religious congregation's accountants. The IDC report only showed financial summaries in relation to the laundries, excluding all other sources of income, including state grants and funding, donations, land sales, bequests, shares, etc. The IDC report tells us the committee is conscious of the fact that none of the statements of income and expenditure examined in this chapter were subject to independent audit, and that, as outlined above, there were some differences of approach adopted by the laundries in the recognition and allocation of costs. This was the graph published in the IDC report demonstrating the average annual income and expenditure for the Galway Magdalene Laundry over a 24-year period between 1943 and 1971, showing a net surplus equivalent to €49,771 in 2011 values. However, some relevant information was found while the IDC were in operation. In May 2012, and remember the IDC report was published in February 2013, Professor James Smith of Boston College, award-winning author of Ireland's Magdalene Laundries and the Nation's Architecture of Containment, was granted access for one day to the Galway Diocese archives on an unrelated matter. The IDC states not all records survived from the Galway Magdalene Laundries, saying of the remaining records in Chapter 7 that, referring to merged record of all women known to have entered the Magdalene Laundries, Galway Magdalene Laundry were therefore of limited use, and their inclusion in the merged list would have given a misleading picture, as they cannot be said to represent the totality of admissions to Magdalene Laundries operated by the Sisters of Mercy. So they had no entries recorded for the period. Therefore, the Galway Magdalene Laundry records, they were not included in total figures, including routes of entry and overall figure of estimated incarcerations. However, Professor James Smith, during this one day's access, found records from the 1940s and 1950s. Conal O'Flaherty tells us in the Irish Examiner, 4 years on, questions continue to be asked of report into Magdalene Laundries. An academic who had access to one diocesan archive reports accounts of physical abuse and medical neglect and argues that the files are not accurately reflected in the Meticulously report into the laundries. Conal goes on to say, more than 4 years after its publication in February 2013, the Meticulously report on the Magdalene Laundries continues to generate headlines, but for all the wrong reasons. It has been criticised by survivors, advocacy groups, the human rights community and the United Nations. Professor James Smith found a list of 107 named girls and women incarcerated in Galway Magdalene Laundry in 1952. 19 of those names are on the headstone in the graveyard of the Galway Magdalene Laundry. Professor James Smith also found multiple letters in the 1940s from the Reverend Mother to the Bishop of Galway. He wrote that these letters were justifying to the Bishop the disciplinary practices of the institution and defending decisions not to release women to their families, and indeed calling the Irish police to help remove family members from the door of the institution. The only term used to refer to women throughout the archive is penitent, wrote Professor Smith. He also says there is a handwritten letter from a survivor, dated 1955, asserting physical abuse and medical neglect, and a letter from a priest in England confirming the survivor's allegation of abuse. Professor James Smith also found records of a reserve account, where quite a substantial amount of money, relatively speaking, was placed annually, well in excess of what was spent in any given year on living expenses, provisions, clothing, healthcare, for the penitents in the institution. Professor James Smith accessed this account in May 2012, while the IDC were establishing the facts of state involvement with Magdalene Laundries. He informed the IDC of these records, going as far as to compile a list of relevant files and a 10-page summary for their contents for Committee Chair Dr. Martin Matilis on May 10, 2012. The material contained accounts detailing significant physical abuse and medical neglect, as well as financial records for the institution. Conal O'Flaherty goes on to say, although the Department of Justice declined to say who from the Matilis Committee visited the archive and on what date, the minutes of the committee's meeting on June 10th, obtained by the Irish Examiner, show the material had been examined in the intervening 4 weeks. The minutes indicate the material was deemed useful. Minutes from the committee's next meeting on June 26th indicate that Mr. McAleese had analysed the financial records. They also note that the Sisters of Mercy would be asked for input, and the committee member, Nuala Carta, had met with the order solicitors and this issue had been discussed. Ultimately, after the publication of the McAleese report, Professor James Smith first informed the United Nations Committee Against Torture of the existence of the material in the Galway archive in November 2013, following up with an email to Felice Gare, who was the Vice Chair of the United Nations Committee Against Torture, outlining what was held in the archive, namely financial records, a copy of the rules of the institution, letters of complaint about physical abuse, a list of names for the women in the Galway Magdalene Laundry in 1952, and letters from family members and their solicitors attempting to gain release of their sisters or daughters. Professor Smith then expressed his concern that the McAleese report fails to adequately reflect and indeed mischaracterises the material in the Galway Diocesan Archive. Ultimately, the committee did not conduct a thorough review of all the files because if he did, he would have discovered 2 additional years of records, which he fails to report, and he would have uncovered annual accountant reports that demonstrate profit margins greater than what the McAleese report contains. And crucially, he would have uncovered annual reports from the Sisters of Mercy Galway Reserve account, which document how the Magdalene Laundry transferred significant monies into the reserve account every year, from 1957 through 1968, well in excess of, by the factor of 3 or 4 times as much, what was spent in any given year on provisions, clothing and healthcare for the penitents in the institution. In conclusion, and from my perspective, the Diocese of Galway archives establish, without question, the extensive involvement of the Bishop of Galway in the day-to-day life of the Sisters of Mercy Galway Magdalene. Moreover, it establishes that the Bishop exerted significant control over the financial dealings of the Galway Magdalene, including control over bank accounts, transfer of funds, investment portfolios, property sales, purchasing, etc. The fact that such an extensive archive of material exists in the Diocese of Galway's archives underscores the extent and nature of the relationship. The question of redress for the Magdalene Laundries is one confined to the state and the 4 religious congregations. The Galway Diocesan Archive, and potentially other diocesan archives, puts the Bishop of Galway and potentially other members of Ireland's Catholic hierarchy, and therefore the Catholic Church proper, squarely on the hook, he wrote. The Irish Examiner put a series of questions to the Department of Justice on Professor Smith's claims and the McAleese Committee treatment of the Galway Diocesan Archive. It declined to answer any of them, stating that the committee no longer exists and is therefore not in a position to respond to specific queries. The IDC report states that the financial records for the Donnybrook Magdalene Laundry did not survive. However, from UCD's website, new research contradicts official state narrative on the Magdalene Laundries. Dr. Mark Cohen, UCD School of Law, discovered hundreds of documents relating to the operation of the Donnybrook Laundry after receiving access to its former site by its new owners. In its 2013 report, the IDC said financial records for the Donnybrook Magdalene Laundry did not survive. However, the documents discovered by Dr. Cohen included such records dating from the 1960s to the 1990s. These records show that in 1975 the laundry recorded a surplus on trade that was equivalent in today's terms to almost €544,000. In 1984, this surplus on trade was equivalent in today's terms to nearly €303,000. Based on the analysis of the newly discovered records, the authors behind the research conclude that Donnybrook Magdalene was a profitable enterprise, generating a good financial surplus annually. It routinely transferred between 1/3 and 1/2 of its surplus on trade to the Religious Sisters of Charity, the Catholic religious congregation that operated the laundry. Among other findings from the IDC report contradicted by the unearthed documents is the claim that it was unable to verify if the Donnybrook Magdalene Laundry was awarded a contract for military laundry during the emergency. Dr. Cohen discovered such a contract in Dublin Diocesan Archives, dating from 1941. In a surprising development, the Department of Defence revoked the contract on the basis that the religious Sisters of Charity were in violation of the Fair Wages Clause contained in all state contracts. The authors note that this episode is a striking omission from the report of the IDC and demonstrates that as early as the 1940s that the labour practices of Magdalene Laundries were regarded as suspect. The documents discovered by Dr. Cohen have since been transferred to the University of Galway and are currently being archived. For most of its existence, 100 women were held at Donnybrook Magdalene Laundry. According to Justice for Magdalene's research group, some 315 women and girls died in the institution before its sale in 1992. This book I mentioned previously in episode 2, A Dublin Magdalene Laundry, Donnybrook and Church State Power in Ireland, documents all of this new information and much more. Again, it will be linked in the description. At the age of 21, Patricia Burk Brogan, driven by her sense of duty to help the less fortunate, the poor, became a novice in the Sisters of Mercy order in Galway. However, her perspective drastically changed when she was temporarily assigned to the Galway Magdalene Laundry during the 1960s. Just 1 week in this institution was all it took for Patricia to decide to leave the order. Patricia Burk Brogan bravely exposed the hidden reality of the Magdalene Laundries, where Catholic institutions exploited and oppressed unmarried mothers and young girls. In her testimony, she described the shocking conditions inside the laundry, where women were locked away, treated like slaves, and erased from society. Despite the controversy, Patricia wrote a play called Eclipsed based on her experiences. Initially rejected by theatres all over Ireland, a small company eventually staged it in a small Galway theatre. Despite backlash and hate mail, Patricia's work shed light on the atrocities, revealing the collusion between the church and the state and the profound suffering endured by these women. Patricia described how, upon entering the Galway Magdalene Laundry, as she was accompanied along the corridor, the doors were locked behind her. She spoke of the steam, she could hardly breathe with the stench of bleach, and of the elderly, middle-aged and young girls, all seeming to blend in with the machinery, become part of the laundry. She said they were out of the sun, locked away, like slaves working. She was told these girls and women were penitents and outcasts. I just had the courage to ask, how long are they going to be here? Are they going to be here all the time, or are they going to be let out? The answer I got was, sure, if we let them out, they'll be back again in no time, pregnant. Patricia has said these were Catholic people who did this, so-called Christians. They were getting rid of them because there was the thing at the time that having a baby outside of marriage was a desperate sin. The fact that they stole away their lives didn't seem to be a sin at all. I just couldn't understand it. It was like Dante's Inferno. That's how I describe it. Patricia's play Eclipsed has been reenacted all over the world. It has won awards. It has been translated into French, Italian, Dutch, and probably more language. Patricia passed away in 2022, aged 90. Patricia Burk Brogan received much backlash for her work, but it didn't stop. Her archive, a remarkable collection of her literary papers, some personal letters and photos, her artworks, and many more productions of her works, is located at University of Galway. It has been surmised by listening to survivors of Magdalene Laundries that mostly the only hope you had of getting out was if your family signed you out or claimed you. But that was not even a guarantee, as evidenced by the files discovered by Professor Smith, where police were being called to take family members from the door. In other cases, girls and women were placed in jobs, as we have seen in the case studies I've gone through, where it would be referred to as went to a situation. These jobs were often in hospitals or other settings run by the same religious congregations, so not always paid jobs. And they were arranged without consent or consultation with the girls or women. They had no say at all in where they were going. It also seems that sometimes if a woman constantly, repeatedly and persistently looks to be let go, Sometimes it could work. However, dismissal was sudden. You would get no warning, no chance to say goodbye to anyone. They would be given one outfit to wear to replace their institutional uniform. If they had any small personal items, they could take those. Sometimes they would be given a bus or a train fare to get to a destination if they had one. But that was it. Nothing else. They had no other clothes, no money. They could have spent years in Magdalene Laundries, where speaking was prohibited. All they did was laundry, needlework or crafts, and cleaning. They had no life skill development there, no social development, no idea on finances, no work skills, and most often a shattered confidence. They also had been stripped of their identities. Communication was very difficult. Some of the women who did get out managed to meet someone and start a family, but it wasn't easy. Many of the women found they couldn't cope with the close relationships or trying to rear a family after what they had been through. So oftentimes these girls, the daughters of the women from the Magdalene Laundries, would end up in industrial or reformatory schools or Magdalene Laundries, starting or continuing the generational cycle. Some of the girls and women were in Magdalene Laundries because their mothers had been. This went on and on for generations. Once a family got caught up in these institutions, there was little, if anything at all, that they could do to break the cycle. The Magdalene Laundries had indelible effects that continued long after leaving. For those who lost their lives behind Magdalene walls, that is a whole different story. I'm not going to use the details from chapter 16 in the IDC report titled Death, Registration, Burial and Exhumation, because I'm going to use other information and do a standalone episode solely on those who lost their lives behind the walls, because the mass unmarked graves connect Magdalene Laundries and mother and baby homes, as so many other things do. Survivors had been writing to members of parliament for decades. Patricia Burk Brogan's play Eclipsed was first performed in 1992. The documentary Sex in a Cold Climate aired in 1998. The movie based on Magdalene Laundries, The Magdalene Sisters, aired in 2002. The documentary The Forgotten Maggies, 2009. The IDC was established in 2011, and this was the first time any action had been taken in any way by the state to look into the Magdalene Laundries. The resulting report, what we have used throughout this series, is the proof that the Irish state had a close and intimate relationship with Ireland's Magdalene Laundries. The state funded the laundries, they sent girls and women there, and they sent their dirty laundry there, knowing the women were working for no pay. Once someone entered a Magdalene Laundry, they were essentially forgotten. It was a cost-effective way of dealing with Ireland's problems. On the issue of abuse, the IDC went outside of its remit to state the following. A total of 118 women who had lived and worked in at least one Magdalene Laundry came forward and engaged with the committee. The women who shared their stories with the committee included 58 women currently living in nursing homes or sheltered accommodation under the care of these same religious orders. In the introduction by the chairman of the IDC on page 7, we're told, the report also addresses the question of the conditions experienced by and the treatment of women in the laundries, including the question of sexual abuse, which there were no allegations made of against the nuns, physical abuse and verbal or psychological abuse. This is a particularly sensitive and difficult issue to deal with, made more difficult by the very small sample of women available and in a position to share their experiences with the committee. The committee does not make findings on this issue. Although the chapter identifies a number of patterns among the stories shared with it, the committee did not make specific findings in relation to this issue, in light of the small sample of women available. A large majority of the small sample of women who shared their stories with the committee said that they had neither experienced nor seen other girls or women suffer physical abuse in the Magdalene Laundries. Reading through this chapter of the IDC report, in reference to abuses suffered by the girls and women in Magdalene Laundries, it's kind of scattered. I have summarised it to make it a little more comprehensive and to gather it all together. So I'm about to talk you through my summary of what's in the IDC report in this section. Women mentioned instances of mental cruelty, strict routines, and being kept against their will. The women described enduring hardships and enduring these conditions, highlighting the mental and emotional toll of their experiences. Women in Magdalene Laundries frequently experienced verbal abuse, including hurtful, taunting, belittling comments, and derogatory remarks about their family backgrounds. Some were mocked for having no known fathers or accused of having the devil in them. Even those who encountered kindness from some sisters still endured verbal cruelty from others. Women worked under strict and demanding conditions, often performing repetitive tasks like washing and sewing. They had specific workstations and had to follow a highly regimented daily routine. Some women had to work despite being ill, and there were restrictions on speaking or asking questions. The environment was characterized by hard labor, minimal breaks, and limited freedom, with the day structured around laundry work and prayer sessions. Some women were allowed to move to the sewing room, considered a privilege. Women faced strict control over their communication. Their letters were routinely checked, both incoming and outgoing. The content of the letters was scrutinised, and in some cases, the nuns dictated what the women should write. Some women were only allowed to write once a month, and even then, the letters were read by the nuns before being sent out. Restrictions were placed on who they could write to, limiting their communication to specific individuals or locations, further isolating them from the outside world. These practices added to the women's sense of confinement and loss of personal freedom. Women's hair was forcibly cut as a form of punishment or discipline. Some women reported having their hair cut by long-term residents, known as black habits, consecrates, or auxiliaries. Women who answered back or were deemed disobedient faced haircuts as punishment, indicating a means of control and humiliation employed by the nuns at the institutions. Some women had their hair cut short upon entry as a form of control and humiliation. Visitors were discouraged. When allowed, were under strict supervision by one or two nuns. Women reported being punched by non-nun members upon arrival. Slaps with a stick or pulling hair for talking or whispering. One woman described nuns using a stick to intimidate and occasionally physically harass the girls. Another having to wear a cup she had broken around her neck for 3 days. Women were subjected to an overwhelming sense of hopelessness and confusion. They received no explanations for their placement and often believed they would never leave these institutions. The lack of communication and understanding about their situation led to a deep emotional distress, causing some to feel like their lives had ended upon entering the laundry. The fear of never being released and the absence of information or explanations profoundly impacted their mental well-being. From the Rhine report, the IDC report also lists various instances involving women in residential laundries. It includes accounts of hard physical work, instances of physical abuse, and one report of sexual abuse by a co-resident. Neglect, particularly related to education and emotional well-being, is highlighted. Emotional abuse and loss of liberty, social isolation, and deprivation of identity are reported. Some women were given names different from their own upon admission. There are also reports of warnings against forming relationships. However, the IDC, due to lack of access to records, say they couldn't decipher which, if any, of these instances referred specifically to Magdalene Laundries. The testimony taken directly from survivors by Justice for Magdalene's group, which was received by the IDC during their research, included punishments for refusal to work, including deprivation of meals, solitary confinement, physical abuse, forced kneeling for long periods, or humiliation rituals, including shaving of hair. Survivors speak of constantly being under surveillance, being verbally insulted, feeling cold, having a poor diet, and enduring humiliating and inadequate hygiene conditions. None of the girls received an education, and survivors dwell on this fact as determining their loss of opportunity in later life. 2 weeks following the publication of the IDC report in February 2013, the state apology was given to the survivors of the Magdalene Laundries, and Mr. Justice John Quirk was given the job of working on a recommended scheme for the survivors for the following few months. Justice John Quirk submitted his report to the government in June 2013, the Magdalene Commission report, also known as the Quirk Report. All recommendations submitted by Justice Quirk were accepted in full by the government. The government subsequently expanded the programme to include 2 more institutions: St Mary's Domestic Training Centre in Stanhope Street and the House of Mercy Domestic Training School in Summerhill, Wexford. These 12 establishments are collectively referred to as the Magdalene institutions under the ex gratia scheme. The restorative scheme was to include a one-time ex gratia payment, which is a tax-free gift, admitting no wrongdoing or liability, and it was offered to Magdalene survivors, reaching up to €100,000 for those who spent a decade or more in a Magdalene laundry. Half was given up front, with the rest paid in instalments based on the woman's life expectancy. If she passed away before completion, the remaining amount reverted back to the state. They were entitled to a pension for life, the equivalent to a HAA card, and this was the most important aspect because health services were in dire need. The services available under the HAA medical card include GP services, prescriptions, dental services, oral services, aids and appliances, home support, home nursing, counselling, chiropody, podiatry, physiotherapy and complementary therapies. It also included funding to be allocated to a form of memorialization, somewhere where the women could meet each other. The stipulation, however, was that to accept this offer, the women had to sign away their legal rights regarding the Magdalene Laundries. These were mostly elderly women in need of health care, appropriate housing, counselling, etc. The women had no choice but to accept this, as the healthcare that was promised by this scheme was urgently required, as was financial aid. The religious congregations involved refused to contribute and refused to apologise for the abuse in the Magdalene Laundries. Why would they do this? Why would they refuse to apologise and refuse to contribute? Well, let's have a look at some possible reasons. The refusal of religious orders to admit abuse or mistreatment or issue apologies regarding the Magdalene Laundries can be attributed to various possible factors. Firstly, there might be a fear of legal repercussions and financial liabilities associated with acknowledging abuse, leading to a defensive stance. Secondly, there could be a deep-seated institutional reluctance to tarnish the reputation of the Church and its members, even in the face of mounting evidence. Additionally, acknowledging abuse would require confronting the moral and ethical implications of past actions, which could be psychologically challenging for both individual members and the institution as a whole. Simply put, the religious orders might not feel forced to admit their mistakes or say sorry, because there aren't strong outside forces making them do so. This lack of pressure allows them to deny the evidence even when it contradicts their claims. They do, after all, point to the IDC report as proof that there was no wrongdoing on their part. They also point to the IDC report as the reason they won't contribute to any redress for the Magdalene Laundry survivors. The IDC report, however, was the result of an investigation into state involvement with the Magdalene Laundries. It wasn't, as recommended by the UN, an independent and thorough investigation into abuse. Therefore, it didn't hold anyone accountable for anything. No perpetrators were prosecuted or punished. The IDC didn't even have the power to do so. They were only to investigate state involvement, which they did. The nuns from the 4 religious congregations involved were repeatedly asked to apologise and to contribute to redress, but have always refused. 2 anonymous nuns involved with Magdalene Laundries agreed to an anonymised radio interview on RTE Radio 1 programme The God Slot, following the publication of the Magdalene Report. The presenter asked them if they would like to take this chance to apologise, and their response in part was for what? With one of the nuns saying, "It's easier for these women to blame the nuns than to blame their mammy or daddy." Maurice Manning, the president of the Irish Human Rights Commission in 2010, said that when the state allows any group or organisation to care for the vulnerable in our society, such as was the case with the Magdalene Laundries, without proper oversight mechanisms, it is almost inevitable that human rights will be breached. Maureen Sullivan told The Guardian following the publication of the IDC report, there was physical abuse, where they would dig you in the side with a thick cross off the rosary beads, where you got a thump on the side of the head, and where there would be constant putting you down, shouting, verbal abuse. You got the cross in the side of the ribs if you slowed down on your way around the laundry. The nuns ate very well while we were on dripping, tea and bread. I remember another torture, one when we were all hungry. We could smell the likes of roast beef and cooked chicken wafting from where the nuns were eating. That was like another insult. With Mary Steed saying, referring to her mother's incarceration, she lost me to adoption after spending the first 2 decades or more of her life in these institutions. So when she was released into the world, she was vulnerable and susceptible to any man that paid her attention. She was in her mind 10 years old rather than a mature woman, and as fair prey she found herself pregnant and then got sent down to a home for single mothers and was forced to give me up. It was a generational chain reaction and a cycle we see often in the Magdalene women. The vicious cycle tends to continue. It was slightly less miserable than what my mother experienced, but it was still pretty bad with a lot of stigma, a lot of shame. This was the chain reaction going on. I tracked my mother down in the early 1990s and she was open at long last to talk. She had had no other children because she feared having any more. She told me right out, "Mary, I was just so afraid that if the nuns didn't take another baby, then God would." So out of fear, she and her husband decided not to have any more children. Flowers for Magdalenes. From Justice for Magdalenes. At least 1,663 former Magdalene women are buried in cemeteries in Ireland, many of whom are in unmarked graves. Flowers for Magdalenes is the brainchild of Anya Downs of Sinn Féin Women, who approached Justice for Magdalenes in 2012 with a view to establishing an annual event to commemorate the women and girls who died in the Magdalene Laundries. It was agreed from the outset that the event would be non-political and would centre around the simple act of laying flowers at Magdalene graves. This has become a yearly tradition. The Magdalene Laundries continued to make headlines in the following years. 2014, the Journal headline, "Women yet to receive a penny on anniversary of apology to Magdalene survivors, calling on the Taoiseach to take action on legislation relating to the apology." The delays are of deep concern given the age of the women and that many are in declining health. We are aware legislation is pending but needs to be acted on as soon as possible. The women should not have to wait. Many are finding it difficult to engage support in obtaining their records. Contrary to the Minister's statement, the Machleys Committee only ever established the facts of state involvement. The nuns have not apologised, nor will they contribute to the compensation fund. There can be no restorative justice without an admission of wrongdoing. The Human Rights Committee and the United Nations Committee Against Torture, each year since 2013, have come back to Ireland expressing concern and disappointment and asked the Irish state when or if they're going to do this independent and thorough investigation into the allegations of abuse in the Magdalene Laundries. The Irish state's response was that they could find no factual evidence to support allegations of systematic torture or ill treatment of a criminal nature in these institutions. In the absence of any credible evidence of systematic torture or criminal abuse being committed in the Magdalene Laundries, the Irish government does not propose to set up a specific Magdalene inquiry of investigation. In 2016, Felice Gare sharply criticised the government's view that there was no evidence to support claims that abuse took place in the laundries, and accused it of walking back on the state apology made in 2013 by then Taoiseach Enda Kenny. Ireland's response: "There's no factual evidence to support allegations of systematic torture or ill treatment of a criminal nature in these institutions. There has been no court ruling that the state had any liability for women who entered such institutions, nor have we ever seen any legal advice or factual evidence that would give rise to the belief that the state has any legal liability." So by 2016, we're back to square one, where the state are saying private run institutions, we had nothing to do with the girls and women, they were not our concern, and there's no evidence of physical abuse. 2017, the Journal headlines: UN criticises government for failure to prosecute abuse perpetrators in Magdalene Laundries. On the 27th and 28th of July 2017, Ireland was re-examined by the United Nations Committee Against Torture. From Justice for Magdalene's research, United Nations rightly recognises that the McAleese inquiry falls far short of the committee's original recommendations on the issue in 2011. In this regard, it has again called on the Irish state to undertake a thorough, impartial investigation into allegations of ill treatment of women at the Magdalene Laundries, that has the power to compel the production of all relevant facts and evidence, and, if appropriate, ensure the prosecution and punishment of perpetrators. The UN also points to the inadequate steps taken by the state to uncover all available evidence of abuses held by private institutions, or to ensure that victims are able to access information that could support their claims, and it links these failures to the McAleese Committee's decision to return the records provided by the religious congregations to them.
The United Nations Committee Against Torture has asked the government to invite a UN Special Rapporteur to visit the state on the issues of Magdalene Laundries and mother and baby homes. The committee is reviewing the state's human rights record. At a hearing today, its rapporteur, Felisa Gare, said the government seems to be walking back from the apology by the former Taoiseach Enda Kenny to Magdalene survivors and going back to a view that the state is not liable.
16th of February 2017, from Justice for Magdalene's research. Justice for Magdalene's research complains to the Ombudsman that the Magdalene Restorative Justice Scheme has not been implemented as promised. So Ombudsman Peter Tyndall reviewed how the restorative scheme was being administered, as many survivors were still waiting for what had been promised to them. The Ombudsman said in the foreword of his report, "The incarceration of women in the Magdalene Laundries and the forced labour to which they were subjected is one of the sorriest episodes in our history. The existence and use of the Magdalene Laundries was a scandal. The restorative justice scheme created an opportunity to belatedly offer some redress to the women who lived and worked in the laundries. This opportunity was lost in respect of some of the women whose cases I considered. It is now time for the state in administering the scheme to reflect the generosity of spirit which characterised the official apology." So in 2017, the Ombudsman released a report, an investigation by the Ombudsman into the administration of the Magdalene Restorative Justice Scheme, Office of the Ombudsman, Dublin 2017, evaluating the scheme's functioning, which he heavily criticised, and proposed several recommendations, all of which were accepted again by the government. In response to one of the Ombudsman's suggestions in May 2018, the government chose to extend the scheme to cover women employed in the laundries of the 12 institutions, even if they resided in one of the 14 neighbouring institutions. The Ombudsman also said there was an over-reliance on the records of the congregations, and it is not apparent what weight, if any, was afforded to the testimony of the women and or their relatives. 2 weeks later, on the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, it's been 5 years since the government apologised to the women of the Magdalene Laundries, but it has yet to implement restorative justice, writes Maeve O'Connor. Monday marked the 5-year anniversary of Enda Kenny's emotional apology to Magdalene Laundry survivors. It was a night the public will never forget, and I'm sure the government would like us to believe it was the night the injustice ended. Truth be told, for many of the women that apology might as well not have happened at all. Referring to the IDC report, however, that chapter does not question whether the women were arbitrarily deprived of their liberty or whether they were forced to work unpaid. The chapter fails to classify forced labour as physical abuse, and it characterises several forms of physical assault as emotional maltreatment. The McAleese report explicitly acknowledges it did not have the mandate to investigate and could not make findings of abuse, including because it did not issue a public call for complaints. Following the Ombudsman's appearance before the Justice Committee a fortnight ago, a senior departmental official asserted to the committee that the issue has not been tried in any court, and that there is no acceptance of liability on the part of the state for what happened in Magdalene Laundries. What he failed to explain was that the government had forced Magdalene survivors to sign legal waivers foregoing their right to sue the state in court as a condition of the acceptance into the restorative justice scheme. Since 2013, the Department of Justice has repeatedly told UN human rights bodies that the IDC report found no factual evidence to support allegations of systematic torture or ill treatment of a criminal nature in these institutions. So is it any wonder that, in the Ombudsman's words, quote, failings in how the scheme was administered served to reinforce the women's feelings of marginalisation and deep hurt, and to undermine the restorative effect of the emotional apology delivered by Taoiseach Enda Kenny, unquote. Is it any wonder that, in addition to the Ombudsman's complaints, other aspects of the scheme have not been implemented? The Ombudsman is not the only one to have criticised the lack of restorative justice in the Magdalene scheme over the past 5 years. Since the then Taoiseach's apology, the UN Committee Against Torture, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the UN Human Rights Committee, and UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights have all stated their grave concern at the denial of justice and redress to survivors of Ireland's Magdalene Laundries. These human rights bodies have called not only for full implementation of the government's redress promise, but also for an investigation into and accountability for the widespread rights abuses committed in the institutions. In Global Sisters' report, Catherine O'Donnell, the spokesperson for Justice for Magdalene's research group, stressed that much more is needed to be done in order to bring closure to this painful part of the women's past. The Department of Justice was supposed to have a dedicated unit to help these women access all the kinds of services such as housing, healthcare, counselling, and they haven't done that. There is a myriad of ways in which they are reneging on the redress scheme, O'Donnell said. 10th of April 2017, Justice for Magdalene's research writes to Taoiseach and Minister for Justice Francis Fitzgerald requesting assistance from the Department of Justice to organise a meeting of the Magdalene survivors and a consultation on memorialisation. The 9th of May 2017, Justice for Magdalene's research writes to Taoiseach Enda Kenny requesting his assistance in organising a meeting of the Magdalene survivors and a consultation on memorialisation. 2018, the government repeated its view to the UN that there is no credible evidence of systematic torture or criminal abuse being committed in the Magdalene Laundries. Dublin Honors Magdalenes. From Justice for Magdalene's research, on June the 5th and 6th, 2018, over 230 women who survived the Magdalene Laundries gathered in Dublin to take part in Dublin Honors Magdalenes. From June the 4th, survivors of the Magdalene Laundries began to arrive in Dublin from right across the island. Others returned to Ireland from the UK, the USA and Australia, some for the first time. In this 2-minute clip from Eclipsed Questions and Answers with Dr. Maeve O'Rourke, we hear why and how the Dublin Honors Magdalenes event came about.
And another thing that hasn't been given yet is a form of memorialisation. The women said that they would like to meet each other because many of them, if they escaped, it was without notice. Their names were changed in the institutions. It's been very difficult for the women to meet each other since. Yeah. And they wanted to consult and to oversee the creation of a national memorial, which could be a museum or other place of memorialisation, so that future generations could learn about these abuses and so that it can never happen again. And we definitely see that survivors of these gross abuses really speak out because they want to make sure that things change. They know, you don't have to tell them, nothing's going to change the past for them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What they want is for it to have mattered so that it doesn't happen again. So that's what memorialisation means, making sure it doesn't happen again. So because no movement had been taken on that in 2018, my colleagues in Justice for Magdalenes and I and Nora Casey, who's a very successful businesswoman, came together and voluntarily arranged an event called Dublin Honors Magdalenes. We did manage to get the funding from the Department of Justice after we had organised it, which was great. And over 200 women came from all over the world. Right. And they met each other and they spent one of the days discussing in tables of 10, each facilitated by a couple of academics or other people who have been involved in research and advocacy, and discussing what they would like us to know about what they went through, what they want done about it, and their views on what memorialisation means. So That report is really important reading for everybody, and it's available on the website of the Justice for Magdalene's Research webpage. It's under Dublin Honors Magdalene's, the findings of the listening exercise.
When we came off the buses, I thought, gee, I can't believe this. What's going on? They were just so wonderful. I mean, they were like genuinely supportive.
We had a right to hold our heads up high. And that's what they were telling us. Hold your head up.
It was controlled by fear. Suppression, beating, starvation. Talk about the Handmaid's Tale, bloody hell. They must have got the idea of the Magdalene Laundries, if you ask me.
There are a lot of the women, they'd never ever spoken to their family. They'd never told them what had happened to them. It was a huge issue for them to speak out for the first time.
During Dublin Honors Magdalene's, President of Ireland Michael D. Higgins again apologised to the survivors for the hurt that was done to them. Justice for Magdalene's Research conducted a listening exercise with the survivors, revealing their concerns about the health card promised in the Magdalene Restorative Justice ex gratia scheme. Contrary to the Burk report recommendations, survivors received basic healthcare services similar to those provided to state medical card holders, despite expecting enhanced services after signing away their right to sue the state. One survivor reporting that although being assured of various free health services including medical, surgical, nursing, dental, counselling and more, she had only received free medicine and counselling out of those promised services, with many others responding the same. Free medication was basically all that they were in receipt of, which was far from what was promised in the scheme. Survivors living outside of Ireland were not informed what redress they were entitled to. I'm going to read you some of the responses from the survivors, but I urge you to go on to Justice for Magdalene's Research website and to get a true reflection of what this event actually entailed, and most importantly, what the women had to say themselves. Here are some of the women's responses. What I'd like people to remember about the Magdalene Laundries is they punished women for situations that the women had no control over. They punished them as children and blamed them for situations that they were in that they had no control over. The regime, it was a regimented way of life, and there was a regime, and it was a very harsh regime. And some of the girls were very young. I suppose it doesn't matter what age they were, just that the cruelty, the hard labour, working, you know you're not getting paid at the end of the week. I hope it will never happen again. I call the Magdalene Laundries illegal confinement. The rape victims were singled out. I remember one woman had a child, and the priest got up on the altar when he found out she was pregnant. She'd to leave the parish as a bad example. He would never mention the man responsible. It was all women that was punished, while the guilty walked free. One survivor referencing the IDC Report or IDC Report said, afterwards, upon reflection and reading his report, I gathered that all of us who were in the industrial schools and spoke to him, we all associated the word abuse as beatings. We weren't associating the psychological, the solitary confinement, the name changing. He should have been more specific to us because he was the so-called educated person. And he should have said, when you're talking about abuse, there's different types of abuse. And I've come to realise afterwards, only when I read his, I thought, oh my God, I said no. But yet I was telling him I was in solitary confinement as well. People out there think when they hear of Hyde Park or where they hear laundries that we were all prostitutes. We are not all prostitutes. And people just assumed because Mary Magdalene, because that name was there, they thought we were prostitutes from the streets. And it's so awful. It's a label we've carried all them years. I went into the chemist and I was actually asked in the chemist, oh, do you have a baby? I had to go into the dentist there with my card from the Magdalene redress scheme, and I thought, everybody knows. And we don't all have babies. I didn't have a baby. Assuming that you had a baby and that was it, end of story. Any young people getting involved with the nuns, keep as far away from them as possible. Let me tell you what the nun said to the rape victim. The woman said she was frightened, and the nun said, you're always whinging. She said, you never stop whinging. And she said, if I could only get out. And the nun turned around and said to her, out? When you were out, you weren't able to mind yourself. Imagine saying that to a rape victim. And in saying this, there was some very, very bad nuns. But I also have to say there was a couple very good. One nun in particular who stood up to the others who were bullies. And to them people, I kept in contact all my life until they died. But as for the others, it's terrible to say the word hate because it's not right, but you can't help how you feel. Just as for Magdalene's research said, for the women who survived the Magdalene Laundries, it is important that we learn from the past and ensure it doesn't happen again. They want assurances that nothing like what happened to them will ever be allowed to recur. Above all, the women insist that what happened to them should never be forgotten. Open Heart City is born. The last Magdalene Laundry to close its doors in 1996 is believed to be the ideal place for memorialisation. However, word gets around, it's about to be sold. People spring into action. Open Heart City is a community-driven initiative born in response to the 2018 decision by Dublin City councillors to prevent the sale of a 2-acre former Magdalene Laundry site on Sean McDermott Street to a Japanese budget hotel chain. The councillors, deeply moved, acknowledged that privatising the site would squander the chance to establish a globally acclaimed site of conscience in the heart of Ireland's capital, particularly in an area marked by economic challenges and social exclusion since the founding of the Irish state in 1922.
This is the building that was known to generations of Dubliners as the Gloucester Street Laundry. It ceased its operations on the 25th of October 1996. It was the last operational Magdalene Laundry of its type left in Ireland. Around town, this is where we all knew our parents meant when their misbehaviour would lead them to say, the nuns will come and get you if you don't stop messing. It is the last Magdalene Laundry that is in the possession of the state. And last year it was placed up for sale by Dublin City Council. This is a location that was considered suitable for a memorial to pay tribute to the Magdalene women both past and present. There was once talk of a museum or a beautiful garden that could really capture the horrors of this institution. Now, however, it's unelected officials who tell us that it is they who will decide the type of memorial that it happens here. Let's just stop this fallacy now. As a nation, we are defined not only by what we choose to commemorate, but by how we choose to commemorate it. There are very few families amongst us whose very recent lineage was not impacted by the mass incarceration that occurred within this state. At this site are the 900 Magdalene Laundry sites, the mother and baby homes, the industrial schools, the mental institutions, the orphanages. The Irish people need a physical space where future generations can touch the walls and know that what occurred here wasn't exaggerated. That Irish women were forced into religious controlled labour camps in the belief that through constant labour, prayer and isolation that they could be cleansed of some perceived immorality. The back of this laundry looks very different to the front. If you're familiar with Railway Street, you'll know that it's one of the most visually depressing streets in the state. As a public representative for this area, I believe that we could create something truly meaningful here. First, a centre of commemoration and remembrance to all those women incarcerated here. Beyond that, we can start to improve the area. We're building into some form of a social history museum to allow us to capture and celebrate the many wonderful aspects of our own history. We aren't ready. Ireland isn't ready to sell off the Gloucester Laundry. The laundry with two faces, which sits in the heart of our nation's capital, which closed its doors a mere 21 years ago. At a very minimum, we need to excavate this site. And when we do, one of the things we may find is a better understanding of ourselves.
Magdalene survivor Elizabeth takes her case against the Irish state for the abuses and neglect she suffered in an industrial school and 3 Magdalene Laundries to the UNCAT. The IDC report had stated all files used in their research would be stored centrally and may be useful for future researchers, apart from the files of the religious orders, which were given back to them with all copies destroyed. Initially, when requests for any of these files were made, they were informed the files were being kept safe, not available under Freedom of Information Act. Then they became available under Freedom of Information Act, but that doesn't mean they were easily accessed. August 2018, Conall O'Farda in the Irish Examiner Campaigners frustrated as state won't open up Magdalene archives. From Justice for Magdalene's, when researching for this book, the editors made a Freedom of Information request to the Taoiseach's department for all records in the IDC archive concerning DML. The Taoiseach's department refused the request, stating that it would exceed the costs allowable under the Freedom of Information Act to search through the archive for certain records. The department recommended that the editors instead make individual Freedom of Information requests for all original sources of state records, and the department provided the editors with the index to the IDC archive. Over many months in 2021-2022, Sheila Ahern made numerous Freedom of Information requests in an attempt to piece together the IDC archive from scratch. As Ahern explains in this summary, all requests but one to the Department of Rural and Community Affairs were refused. Having had little success using Freedom of Information, Ahern visited several public archives where she accessed a range of records. Notably, National Archives of Ireland staff advised that most NAI files referenced in the IDC report are closed files, which require special permission from the relevant government departments to access. Therefore, these files were not provided. Why has no one sued the religious orders? It's a question many people ask, and it's been asked in the comments throughout the episodes. Well, in Ireland, religious orders are not legal entities. Religious orders are classed as unincorporated associations. So, unincorporated associations, such as religious orders, cannot be sued directly. In England and Wales, the law says that any document that needs to be given to an unincorporated association can be given to any member involved in managing the unincorporated association. However, in Ireland, there is no law to make sure that someone must appear in court as a representative of a club, society, or other unincorporated association. This makes it hard for people in Ireland who want to sue an unincorporated association. The information I've just given you is taken from lawreform.ie. So my belief is this law is at least being looked at, hopefully will be changed. 2022. Elizabeth, who had taken her case against the state to the United Nations on the 31st of October 2022, Elizabeth Copen lost her case, due in part to the fact that the named perpetrators are now deceased and due to statute of limitations. 3 members of the UN strongly disagreed. Orla Ryan writes about the UN's decision in the journal. United Nations Committee Against Torture's decision last October was not unanimous. In a somewhat unusual move, 3 committee members dissented. In their joint dissenting opinion, Anna Raku and Erdogan Iskan wrote, "We disagree with the committee's conclusion under Article 12 that the state party took the necessary measures to conduct an objective and timely investigation into the complainant's claims. The record demonstrates that the state party, other than gathering information, has failed to conduct a prompt, independent and thorough investigation into allegations of arbitrary detention, forced labour and ill treatment, to which the complainant has been subjected. The committee's decision sets a discouraging precedent, undermining the obligations under Article 12. Raku and Iskan also noted that while the compensation is an important form of reparation, it never replaces a full rehabilitation. It is not a formal acknowledgement of truth and harms suffered. Without truth and acknowledgement of what happened, no amount of money can be rehabilitative or fix the pain and suffering inflicted. Ex gratia payments and waivers prevent the survivors from ever seeking truth in the courts. This may amount to impunity. Denying access to justice and accountability leads to denial of the right to seek full rehabilitation." Todd Buchwald, who also dissented, outlined his reasoning in a separate statement. He noted that the committee's decision in this case is at odds with its previous stance on the matter. Most significantly, this case does not come to the committee on a blank slate. The committee in 2017 concluded that the state party has not undertaken an independent, thorough and effective investigation, and explicitly reiterated these conclusions in the May 2019 letter of its rapporteur of follow-up. The committee itself is formally on record that the state's party investigations were insufficient to pass muster. One may ask what the committee thinks has changed between then and now. To be clear, there are unquestionably situations in which it is appropriate for the committee to modify or reverse previous conclusions. However, it is incumbent upon the committee to offer some kind of genuine explanation of why it is reversing itself, and failure to do so risks undermining the respect for the committee's work that is essential for all to be effective. That seems particularly so in the present case, where the alleged conduct was pervasive and occurred over a protracted period of time. In the absence of such an explanation, I find myself unable to join in the committee's decision. March 6, 2018. Conall O'Flaherty on WordPress. 7 die in wait for Magdalene Laundry redress payment. 7 vulnerable Magdalene Laundry survivors have died without receiving a penny of the redress that were granted in 2013. Justice for Magdalene's research said it was devastated that women had died while awaiting a payment they are entitled to. Mr. Martin confirmed that of the 39 women deemed as not having the necessary capacity to sign the required legal documents, 7 had, unfortunately, died without receiving any redress payment, despite being accepted to the scheme 5 years ago. A further 17 of these women have yet to receive any payment. 3 are now in the wards of court process. In his report in November, Ombudsman Peter Tyndall said these women had been effectively forgotten by the department due to a delay in fully enacting the Decision-Making Capacity Act, labelling the delay inexcusable. He said this was particularly so when Mr. Justice Quirk alluded to the delay in his report, while it was also flagged in internal communications within the department. There are 17 women in this position, 9 of whom had spent more than a decade in the institutions, and are entitled to the maximum payment of €100,000. Mr. Martin also confirmed that 75 women who were in Magdalene Laundries were subject to an interview, as no records could be found showing them having been admitted to the laundry. Some Magdalene survivors received redress payments, but discrepancies existed in the amounts given. Justice for Magdalene's research advocated for better support for survivors under religious orders control. Justice for Magdalene's research criticised the Department of Justice for lacking transparency in interviews with survivors. The department didn't fully accept the Ombudsman's recommendations. There were calls for immediate payments to the waiting survivors. 2022. Some good news. Some really good news. NUI Galway's Irish Centre for Human Rights has published secondary school teaching materials on Ireland's institutional abuses, which have been created with survivors and school teachers, pupils, activists and artists. It is our hope in the future the Irish state will incorporate historical abuses into the Irish Leaving Certificate curriculum. Until then, our pilot programme is available to teachers all over Ireland, said Emily O'Reilly, one of the 5 students who developed the resources. We have created a 2-hour-long lesson plan that teaches students about the human rights violations that occurred in Ireland's institutions throughout the 20th century and continue today. We have emphasised survivor testimony and artistic works by survivors in the lesson plan. 2022. Ireland's Dirty Laundry documentary on Ireland's Magdalene Laundries airs. 2023. On the 22nd of March 2023, in Dáil Éireann, Deputy Ivana Basic in essence put it to Taoiseach Leo Varadkar the matter of the inconsistencies documented in the recent publication titled A Dublin Magdalene Laundry, Donnybrook and Church State Power in Ireland, shedding new light on the Donnybrook Magdalene Laundry, challenging key findings in the 2013 IDC Report. And she asked Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, will the Taoiseach acknowledge some key inaccuracies in the McAleese report that have been shown up by this book? Second, will the government now introduce legislation to criminalise the destruction, alteration or failure to preserve institutional records by those who possess them, including those who were involved in these Magdalene Laundries, which were terrible institutions? The Taoiseach responded, I have received a copy of the book Deputy Basic referred to, but I have not yet had time to read it, so I cannot comment on the assertions made by the authors or adjudicate on them. In relation to records relating to Magdalene Laundries, major work is currently underway to establish a central repository of records within the National Centre for Research and Remembrance. The repository will encompass records related to industrial schools, reformatories, Magdalene Laundries, mother and baby homes and related institutions. So hopefully the official narrative will be updated with all relevant information. Alison O'Reilly writes in the Irish Examiner, the government approves plan for National Site of Conscience at former Magdalene Laundry. Senator Mary Fitzpatrick welcomes government commitment to create a National Centre for Research and Remembrance at the former Magdalene Laundry site on Sean McDermott Street, Dublin 1. Where are we now? Well, the official narrative remains to be the meticulously report, the IDC report. The state still claim no liability for the girls and women who were detained or incarcerated in Magdalene Laundries. They deny that these were abusive institutions, and they claim again girls and women were not held against their will. I do not know what it was like to be incarcerated in a Magdalene Laundry. I do not know how these girls and women suffered. I do not know how these girls and women continue to suffer today, or what their lives are like. I wasn't there. I couldn't know. I can't begin to imagine what it was like. But I feel strongly that spreading awareness and telling the full truth of Ireland's Magdalene Laundry to the best of my ability with what resources I could find of utmost importance. I truly hope I have not upset anyone in doing so. For my part, all I can do is try keep our hidden past current, talk about it, tell you about it, and hope you talk about it. Recurrence is not an option. But for as long as the truth of the Magdalene Laundries continues to be denied, holding no one accountable, there is always the possibility of recurrence. It can just be denied again. If we can't admit what was done and how it was wrong, what's to stop us from doing it again? How do we know it's not going on right now? Thank you for listening to the case of Ireland's Magdalene Laundries. Take care of yourself, take care of each other. Good luck and goodbye.